The arts and creative people, they're all very huggy.
Yep.
You can imagine how well I fit into that. But
exactly.
anyway,
I was just laughing. I'm like, Elliot, like,
yeah, it's very difficult.
Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories. Welcome back to So Here's My Story. I'm Jody.
I'm Elliot.
And I know we mentioned getting into the Facebook group all the time, but especially based on last week and this week's episodes on what's happening with the corona COVID-19, that this would be, I would really love to personally invite you into the Facebook group, because I think this is a time where we can be talking about some things that aren't just personally meaningful, but are really helpful to broader businesses in terms of decision fatigue and decision paralysis, and helping each other see how we're making some of these really
working
important
together
decisions.
as a community.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
creating community around something that really, really needs it. So if you have not done so, a couple quick ways to get there. If you're on Facebook, on our Facebook page, there's a link right there to the group. You can go to our website at sohere'smystory.com, and there's a link to the group. And those are the two best ways to get there. So
Okay.
see you soon.
So here's my story. Last week, I was up at HPS, which is where I go in New Jersey for speaking and mentoring and to level up and in the public speaking world. Now, at HPS, people fly in from all over the country, actually all over the world, to take part in this training. And that's a particularly dicey thought when in this environment with the coronavirus and the various hotspots around the world. So I was really curious as to how HPS was going to address this. Now, they didn't want to cancel. They didn't want to say, well, we'll do everything remotely, because so much of their craft depends upon teaching how to speak in front of an audience, how to move on stage, how to do things and be present literally and figuratively with your audience. And so people who have paid a lot of money for this training would not get nearly the quality of instruction and the quality of experience that they were looking for. So what HPS did was attack it in two ways. The first way is they said, okay, look, if you're not going to come, either because you can't because you're on quarantine, you don't want to because you want to avoid crowds, which is perfectly rational and reasonable, or you've been around somebody, you just have concerns, you're not necessarily on quarantine, but you don't want to risk other people's. For whatever reason, if you don't want to come.
Yeah, for a lot of people, it's about, I have one client who has an immune suppressed child at home. He's like, I'm going to be fine. He's like, but I just am not willing to
you're living with elderly parents,
yeah, exactly.
Whatever it happens to be. So they went to great pains to set up remote. And I don't mean just Zoom sessions, but I mean getting equipment so that for the parts where the entire cohort is in a room, they have the multidimensional microphones, they have the cameras set up so that it automatically focuses on the person who's speaking. And, so they did their best to make it as present an experience as possible for those who are remote. The second thing that they did is HPS is a very supportive community, and they also happen to be a very huggy community. Much like if you've ever been involved in drama, in high school drama and plays and whatever, the arts and creative people, they're all very huggy.
Yep.
You can imagine how well I fit into that. But anyway,
exactly. I was just laughing. I'm like, Elliot, like,
yeah, it's very difficult. But the fact of the matter is they said, look, I know that you guys hug each other and you greet each other effusively and all that stuff. What we're going to do is we're going to, if you want to, instead of handshakes, we're just going to do
jazz hands.
Jazz hands.
No, was it really jazz hands?
Yes, it was jazz hands. We're going to do jazz hands.
That's been my fun joke the past week.
No, that's what they did. Or you can do virtual hugs and you can't, you cross your hands like the Wakanda thing, cross your arms over your chest.
By the way, nobody can do any of those things I've found without having to comment in the moment, like since we're not allowed, like there's always some like little phrase that has to go with it to acknowledge, like I'm not just being weird. It's like a thing.
Well, but see, that's exactly the point. So with HPS, because they made such a big deal out of that, they had to normalize it for everybody.
Right.
And the reason they did that is because out of, let's say, 60 people who would be present at the HPS facility, 54 of them may be fine with shaking hands and giving hugs and all that stuff. But for the 6 who weren't, they didn't want to create an awkward experience where they're like, oh, I'm sorry, I just don't want to touch, I don't want to do whatever. So they had to, for their entire organization, for this entire event, they said, nobody does that.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really interesting to me how they made the decisions to navigate that
Right. Or
problem.
you could have 99% of the people there, following all the basic World Health Organization and CDC rules, which say don't, like if you're going to go to things, don't hug, don't touch hand,
Right.
don't shake hands and whatnot. And you can have that one guy or woman who's like, that stuff's silly. And then there's this weird social pressure when they're coming in for the hug to be like,
Yeah. So that was there. They made, there were a couple of decision points. We're going to hold the event. We're going to figure out how to create the best experience possible for those who can't or choose not to attend. And we're going to establish new cultural rules for those who do attend.
Yeah. So since we recorded our last episode, which just came out yesterday, the way this goes by a week, and I already felt like that episode, like so much has happened in the week since we recorded that episode. A large portion of my days have been involved in conversations about just exactly this.
With your clients.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I've been facilitating countless conversations about how much we do, levels of reactions. Like initial reactions were pretty easy. We're not going to, one of my clients in like 2 weeks is supposed to have this like 300 people in their office. And they're like, I think we can assume that that's probably not a great idea. Like there is relatively clear guidance on just not the best idea.
But that's still a brave and heartbreaking decision to make, because I can imagine the planning.
They've all but made it.
It.
They haven't. I think last week, I will see them again, actually this afternoon. Last week, they weren't quite ready to pull the trigger because it's a really fantastic event. Like, I'm looking forward to it. I'm super bummed. Like, that's the whole point there. There's like emotions, there's smarts, there's wisdom, there's all these things. But the fact is, there are some things that there is very clear, should you choose to take it, the expert organizations, and I don't just mean the CDC and the World Health Organization, but also like Hopkins and Harvard. The schools of public health are putting out tons of information. And some of it is very, very clear. Certain things, don't do that. So that's great if you have things that fall into that category. It's great, although still complex for the people that I've had the conversations with, if your industry lends itself to people working from home to a certain degree.
As does mine, and yours to a certain extent.
To a certain degree, yeah. So that's fantastic if you're in that industry. Even in those industries, I've seen a fair amount of decision paralysis, and I'll say a little bit more in a minute. But then I also just have to acknowledge that for many of my clients, the decision paralysis is real and justified because it is a quandary. Like it is an absolute quandary of not good choices. And here's the interesting thing that I'm seeing. First of all, I would just like to say, if the only people that you have to decide for about to what degree you pay attention to this and how you handle it and whatnot is like you and your immediate family or even like slightly extended family, count yourself really lucky.
Absolutely. Congratulations.
Congratulations. And as hard as it may be, and I am not downplaying the financial and economic impacts that this will be having on people at all, even at that scale.
Be serious, for some people.
But these conversations that I've been in are having to take in these levels of complexity and nuance that are just kind of mind-bending. And most entrepreneurs and leaders are pretty comfortable with not having a lot of certainty. Like we get it that you don't always, there's not some laid out path ahead of you. So they've got some amount of tolerance for that.
And there's not just one right answer.
Exactly. We're really used to be like, okay, I don't know for sure, but I feel pretty good about this methodology or this way I'm going to decide. Well, this is more uncertainty and more unknowns than anyone has really been able to use. And it takes this different kind of courage to lean into the opposite side. Like if you are someone whose MO is, I'm going to push on through, like you have to fight against that potentially to think through some of these impacts.
And it may not just be about you, so I'm going to fight on through isn't going to be a philosophy that's going to take you where you need to go necessarily.
Well, it is if you're the only person you have to decide for.
Right. But that's I think is rare.
Right. Right.
And, and it's also a ripple effect because it's not just, well, I've got an event for X number of people in 2 weeks. I've got a speaking engagement in April that canceled. I've got one in May, and I'm curious what they're going to do.
Yep.
I've got a good friend of mine at HPS is putting on what I know is going to be a fabulous in-person limited, he limited the number, but an in-person transformative coaching workshop. And he doesn't know if he can do it remotely because it's manageable, but it's not going to be nearly the same in terms of the interactions and the off-agenda interactions.
Well, you see it in the politics. I mean, the fact that they're canceling political rallies, like you can't have a rally on Zoom or Skype. It's just not the same thing. And so, but here's the point though that I want to make is we've done an episode before on how, even in the best of situations, there's something lost if you toss out a solution to a problem just because it has a barrier. Like, oh, we can't do that because this would happen.
Right.
Well, we don't have that luxury. Like there are not options at the moment that there's no clean, nicely packaged with a bow on top of it way to go at some of this stuff. I mean, I was telling you before we started recording, I have one client who's has a home healthcare agency.
This is just paralyzing to me.
It's so paralyzing. So she is paying attention, and a lot of her caregivers are actually retired nurses. So a lot of them
a vulnerable population
are actually
themselves.
a vulnerable population. Yeah. So she's already weighing she isn't quite to the point where she feels like she needs to say now is the time that they should all stay home. But a lot of people are just trying to understand when is the right time. Like I don't want the sky is falling, but I also don't want to miss the window, especially because if you are a data geek like I am, and you have ever really paid attention to how things work when they are working exponentially, like when it happens very, very quickly. Well, it's not a big deal when you go from 30 to 60 to 120, but when you go from 2,000 to 4,000 to 8,000 to 16,000, that is where you really see the uptick.
Yeah, and with businesses, I'll just say that sometimes, you mentioned home health care. If you have a business that has its stock in trade in reliability in difficult circumstances, like one of my clients, they do wonderful work, Curry Printing. Their tagline is "Impossible Deadlines Met."
Right.
So if you give them a really difficult deadline and they're like, we really can't do that.
Right.
That really, that takes the rug out from under them.
And that's the point. Like her motto with her company, not actually her motto, but the values by which she makes decisions has always, for my home healthcare client, has always been, we are always there no matter what. There is no excuse. Yeah. We will never call you and say, we can't come today, because their
people
care is, to basic life functionings, like giving the person their medicine or taking care of them, helping them to the bath. I mean, this is stuff they can't, feeding them. This is stuff they can't do without services. Yeah. And they're hired because their family members don't live here. And so making that call, it has an impact that has a lot of weight to it. It's not just like, gosh, we'll have to cancel a bunch of kids' birthday parties. It's like people's lives could. You
don't think Chuck E. Cheese is weighing this decision as heavily as your home healthcare
Chuck
client?
E. Cheese. So anyway, so she has no good options, and she's kind of paralyzed at the moment because she realizes that when she has to make that decision, which is probably sooner than later, it comes with great consequence, no matter which way she decides. Like if she keeps going, it could have dire consequences to her people. So I just want to acknowledge that we are having to lean into and use parts of I think a lot of us have this rut of our go-to, like we are somebody who just likes to always be prepared, or we're somebody who likes to figure it out as we go, or somebody who always relies on, not me, nothing gets in my way. And this requires just a very different kind of come at it. But the problem is I'm seeing people be paralyzed in the decisions. Oh, but I did want to come back to the printing for just a second. Because it also is really funny when you break down the conversation, because one of my clients, we went through this like, well, who is mission critical? Like who has to be here to keep things going? Because all their people could go at home and do their things, except for certain people. And at first somebody said, well, IT would have to be here. And like, well, no, not really. Because unless they have to like plug things, unplug and replug the system. My IT guy remotes in all
the time.
Exactly. So unless the system's down, the IT guy, so we ruled that one out. And then somebody was like, well, I forget what they call it, but it's the people who make all the binders and to print the things and get them ready and put together so that they can take them out to their clients. And somebody said, well, they can really only do that here. And like, well, we could do this. And then somebody said, well, we may just have to outsource that. And we were like, well, but
somebody's going to have to do that.
People may not be there.
Right,
and then they're like, well, we could just email the PDF to the clients. And they're like, if the clients are there, like our brains just aren't used to thinking like 9 steps out from our own thing, because they were coming up with solutions, but still assuming that like the rest of the world would still be in place doing everything that they do.
Because you can say, hey, you know what? In-house quarantine wouldn't be so bad because I can just call Domino's. And then you're like, well, wait a minute. If the Domino's, I'm assuming the Domino's guys are going to come out. I can
just keep ordering things from Amazon.
I can keep ordering things from well, so, and the interesting thing about it to me is if I made a key decision here, and let's say I said, okay, we're in the law firm, we are not accepting this kind of work anymore. That's a big decision, and a lot would go into it. And the stakes are high, but what the stakes are would be limited to my business, which is I could go out of business. The people here could lose a paycheck, have to find something. Those are big stakes, but they are not stakes that endanger my clients' health and well-being.
Right. You don't have to worry about having lives on your hands.
Right. So if I say, okay, well, I'm not going to have this meeting, or I've got an office of 100 people and we're all going, I think we can tough it out and we can all come in. That's a different decision than I'm making a really important business decision. I'm looking at my financial statements to make it.
And then you take all of this, everything we're saying, because we're sort of leaning into the scariest versions of things. And then you add in this other layer of, but what if we're wrong?
Well, you'd never know.
What if nothing's
But in deterrent effects, when it's a deterrent, if the deterrent is successful, if people really stayed home and they did it like nobody moved for 3 weeks.
Right.
And let's say that the virus just petered out. It just died out. People were like, my God, what a massive disruption to the economy. Exactly. And see, this thing just petered out.
Yep. And there's no there's no honor. Valor is the word I was trying to think of, and I'll start to say value. There's no valor in proving a negative.
Right.
So I think that was probably my point, because at the end of the day, in every one of these conversations, it was never said this way, but it always kind of came back to this really deep-seated underlying want to not be the person who overreacted and pulled a trigger too soon, canceled a thing that didn't need canceled, sent people home, because you reckon, and this isn't, I think that's why I so badly wanted to talk about this again, even though we just did an episode last week, is you are not alone in that. And I think noticing it and accepting it, that these are difficult decisions, and we don't have the luxury of navigating by known avoidance of regrets.
No, but what's fascinating to me is the normalization that's occurred. So let's say that if Towson closed, because Towson, as you know, they canceled classes from today on because spring break is happening next week. So they made the decision, no Towson classes or activities from this point. Basically, they started spring break a week early. If they were the only one in the country, what they risk is, oh my gosh, what a bunch of snowflakes. Boy, they are overreacting. What the hell? It's like closing schools because of a little bit of wind and there might be a 20% chance of snow. What a horrible decision administration made. But now it's become normalized, even in this short period of time. A number of schools have closed. People are recalling their study of abroad. Offices are closing. People are making contingency plans. I was at the gym this morning.
Which garners more, snide side-eye looks of like, everyone's overreacting. But
there's a tipping point,
but at least you're not alone.
So I was at the gym this morning, and that's what I could overhear a lot of conversations in the locker room about this. What are you doing with your business? Well, we're doing this. One guy said that he has 18 teenage girls who are staying at his house for 2 weeks because of a quarantine.
What?
Yes, it was just, and I really wanted to know more about that, but then there's this whole eavesdropping in the locker room thing that you don't want to get into.
And I'm not sure that's the conversation you want to be like, tell me more about that.
Exactly. So I don't want to be that guy
How to be creepy
either.
in the locker room.
But he was saying that, that parents were calling concerned and he has a whole bunch of food coming in and all that. Anyway, but the point is that it's become normalized so that there's not as much shame or dishonor in making the decision to pull the trigger of people working remotely or canceling my event or doing something, because some of the big events, South by Southwest, some of the big universities have
that's a decision
canceled.
right there. South by Southwest, that is a major.
So there have been some leaders, and I'll use that word, leaders, in this space of saying, we're going to err on the side of being safe, that I think created some safe space for a lot of other people downstream.
That is exactly where I was yesterday when I was writing this thing, and this is why I do a podcast instead. I start a million articles and I never finish them, but that's why we have the podcast. But I was trying to write yesterday about how there is a very different kind of courage that gets overlooked that I think we're seeing a lot of the courage to cancel TED. The TED Talks in Vancouver were canceled. The South by Southwest.
TEDx Mid-Atlantic right here was moved.
Just made that decision.
Yes.
And they drug their feet a little bit longer because that's exactly the point, though. So the big TED was going to be in Vancouver, and it clearly draws this international audience.
Right.
TEDx Mid-Atlantic, mostly over here. At the time when they were dragging their feet a tiny bit,
really.
there weren't a ton of cases. The only cases that were in the Mid-Atlantic area were cases that were people had come home from. There was no community transmission, and there's still very little known community transmission. So it still has now you've had the things happen in DC, and I think that was really what helped kind of lock it down for them. But that was a good example of, yet again, I feel like we talk about this all the time, but there's such a want to make everything so binary that, you either it's a complete hoax and it's ridiculous and there's no big deal, or we're like locking everybody down and shutting them down. And to me, and this could be a whole other episode, but centrism gets a lot of bad rap, and for good reason, because if you're assuming that the answer is in the middle because it's in the middle between two things, I think that is a very, very, very bad thing to assume that middle ground solutions are always better. But I think there is a massive, massive risk of not exposing yourself to all the bits of the center in search of more accurately defining the problem so that then you can find a good solution to it.
And you also can look to some of the leaders who have done this, whether it's now TEDx Mid-Atlantic or the universities or conferences like South by Southwest, and start to see some of the metrics that they used in making the decision to make your own, depending upon your business, your organization, the effect that you have on others by being there, the effect that you have on others by not being there. I
will say I have some feelers out on this, so I'm not quite ready to share it, but I did in one of the articles I was reading from someone who's a deep data statistician person. He had created this spreadsheet that's pretty involved, and I'm vetting it through a couple people I know who are experts in this field. And it was made for business owners to plug in a few, like 6 or 8 or 10 variables that would be specific to your geography, your business size, your risk tolerance. Like plug this in, and it would help generate it's time to make everybody work from home or close versus not. I don't feel comfortable with that just because who knows if it's the right answers, and I don't know that advice is necessarily helpful. But if there are you were mentioning like what variables did they use to decide? I wish we were hearing more about the behind the scenes piece, because I feel like that's what people need right now, and why I wanted to do this episode is sharing. This would be a great time to be sharing these things in the Facebook group of how are you deciding? Not are you right in your decision or do I think you're right or wrong, but I think we could all benefit from sharing what variables we are using, because then it'll help give me a scaffold to say like, oh, I hadn't thought about that piece.
Right.
Interestingly, in September, both my kids had, I think we did an episode on it, both my kids had pneumonia. Yeah. My daughter had it for 2 weeks, and then about 3 days of healthy, and then my son had it for 2 weeks. And in that period of time, we did not let my 83-year-old mother-in-law anywhere near our house, because she's taken care of the kids when they've had stomach flus and everything possible if I couldn't be there for some reason. For 17 years, she's picked them up from school, watched them in the summer. She's watched them in sickness and in health. She's not terribly frail. So we've never made that decision before, ever. But with pneumonia specifically, pneumonia and 83-year-olds don't get along very well.
Not a good combo.
And even if just that tiny little risk, this was the bigger thing for me, that tiny little risk that something would happen to her. I didn't want my kids having the story that they gave their grandmother pneumonia and she died. Yeah. So no one batted an eyelash when I mentioned that because I had to leave things earlier to do all the pickups for the kids. And they were like, oh yeah, I would never let my mother-in-law. And yet, so I've been leaning into that because of late when I say, earlier this week, we stopped having my mother-in-law pick up the kids and we just want her and my father-in-law to stay home. And I think we're acting a little bit early and I'm okay with that. I'm not willing to, that's my decision for my folks. I'm just not willing to risk it. I could not bear that on my conscience. And so they are staying home. I've gotten some side eye about that. And I just think it's so interesting, because even from some people who totally understood my decision in September. And so I share that not because I think I am deciding by criteria that is better than or worse than other people, but just that I think what is called on for the moment is that we're all going to have to sort of bring our locus of not locus of control, but locus of litmus testing more internally to a certain degree. Like we can't judge by what everybody else thinks. And yet you have to take in all this other information.
No, I think that it helps to take in other information. I think you have to decide on your 4 or 5 factors that matter to you in your circumstance, where you are, who you affect internally, your risk tolerance. And when I say your, not just you as the business owner, but the risk tolerance of those around you. And then what I take from your story with your grandmother, and I believe this wholeheartedly, once you make that decision, it is much better to act early than it is to act late.
So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group.
Which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts.
Your stories.
Your stories.
You can find links to that group as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best
Lovingly
of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us. Which is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.